All right, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Today's Trace Security's last webinar for the year, and we're going to be going over some social engineering and how to strengthen your human firewall against cyber attacks. With me, I have Mr. Jerry Beasley.
Good afternoon.
He's one of our security services managers here at Trace Security, a real expert on this topic, and so he'll be taking us through these things. Just a quick housekeeping thing here. We will be recording the webinar, so if at any point you miss a piece or get distracted, we are going to put this up and send this out to you as soon as we get it edited and ready to go. So yeah, without further ado, I'll let Mr. Beasley take it, and we'll get started.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, folks. It's Jerry Beasley. As Joshua mentioned, I'm a security services manager here at Trace Security, but I'm also an active analyst. My background is about 30 years in information technology and information security management. I perform a large spectrum of services, but it also includes social engineering, both remote and on-site. And this presentation will provide a little bit of insight as to some of the things that we see in other organizations and some of the things that you might be able to do to strengthen your security posture. That's, of course, my name. We'll have contact information afterwards if you have any questions. This is an overview of what we're going to go over. Basically, want to talk about what the threats are, what the specific weaknesses to social engineering are, and then we're going to talk about human defenses. Now, there are all sorts of technical countermeasures you can put in place for remote social engineering attacks and things like that. But what we're really talking about today is human behavior. And we're going to talk about how you can change that human behavior over time. So just not to bore you to death, I mean, everyone can read, but you got a few definitions here. Social engineering is basically manipulating people into doing something you want them to do that they wouldn't ordinarily do. There's a number of ways to do that. Pretexting is basically inventing a scenario or a story in order to get someone to do what you want them to do. It's kind of like the old idea of a con man or a confidence person. Phishing is a means of extracting information as well, but it's typically done via electronic communication like email. Vishing is just the voice version of that. Whenever someone calls your call center or your office, either masquerading as someone or trying to convince you to do something that you wouldn't ordinarily do. So there's a list of the threats. We talked about 3 of them already. There are some other attack variations, and we're not really so concerned about the technical variations as much as how we prepare people to deal with these, but those are listed there. And you may have heard of these. Spear phishing is just a targeted phishing attack. Whaling is against some high priority target like a VIP or executive. There's SMS versions of it. There's also attacks that use a commonly visited website, so a website that your personnel might visit frequently. So the threats are real, and I probably don't have to tell you this. I'm sure you watch the news. But the last full year of data was from 2016, and during 2016, according to the Verizon Data Breach Report, 35% of all data breaches, or over 1/3, involved social engineering. So social engineering was a factor in some form, whether it be via remote messages, phishing emails, or some other type of attack. The number one vehicle is still email attachments, and so that's why many organizations concentrate their training on avoiding phishing attacks. But as we'll see as we walk through the presentation, there are a number of other types of attacks that you still need to be aware of. Some of the techniques of social engineering is basically, again, it's using human nature, and we'll talk a little bit about some of human weaknesses in a little bit, but it essentially boils down to persuasion, persuading somebody of the legitimacy or the reason why you're doing something and that it's the right thing to do, or impersonating someone in a position of authority. So, for example, if I sent an email that appeared to be from your CEO asking you to wire money somewhere, that may sound far-fetched, but if you've watched the news, you may know that that actually has happened in some organizations to the tune of millions of dollars. Urgency is another technique used whenever the attacker will try to make the situation seem urgent and force the victim into a decision. And then also novelty can be used. In other words, you see something new, your curiosity is piqued. But ultimately, the goal is to facilitate some type of fraudulent transaction, or to get you to modify a system for access, or to do something that will provide the attacker with a means to further their attacks and perform malicious activity. The targets are typically for financial institutions, as you can see, account information, credentials, PII. Well, why PII? Well, personally identifiable information is very valuable, especially on the black market, to be sold for people who want to perform identity theft. So if you can't get the account information directly, you can always create new accounts or get access to accounts by using identity theft. So we'll slow down here a moment. So why does it work? Well, people are people, and most people are grown up, they're taught to trust, they're taught to respect authority, they're taught to do the right thing to help others. And so trust, curiosity, but in addition to that, conditioning. Because if you work in an organization where it's very common for people to call you for information, and you're used to providing information to people who you think are legitimate, then after a while it becomes so natural that you don't think twice about it. There's another piece to that, though, and that's a lack of defined protocols. And that all that means is that if you have step-by-step procedures that you normally follow, those protocols can sometimes prevent an attack. If the protocols are not there, then people are left to make a hard decision in a short period of time, and sometimes they make the wrong decision. So I'm just going to pop up a few examples. Now, we talked about phishing. This is just one stereotypical example. Basically, impersonating your bank or another financial institution, asking you to click on a link and fill out information. A couple of things are going to happen when you click on that link. Potentially, the link may try to download and run malware on your system, or even a lower tech approach, but can be just as effective. It may take you to a website where it'll ask you to enter credentials or other personal information. Phishing can be used in other ways. You can have any number of payloads. So this is an example from an actual exercise that took place at a credit union in an undisclosed location, where an email was sent out that appeared to be from the CEO with a holiday greeting. And it also had some other enticing pieces to it. But you'll notice, looking at the top, that the domain name ended in a CU versus the credit union's normally .org. Well, that's simply because the attacker went out and within a matter of minutes registered a phony website and sent it to the list of employee names that they had collected online. You can see in this example, there's a hyperlink at the bottom that says, please click here. Well, what typically happens in a phishing email is that you click on it, it'll take you to some site. As you can see in this case, by hovering over it, the employee might have seen that it was not a legitimate site. So we'll get more into how do you get people to recognize that. Other examples might be face-to-face. So for example, an email might be sent. In this case, this is an actual email from an exercise where I sat out in the parking lot of a credit union branch, and after looking up the name of the branch manager online, I again used a bogus domain and sent an email to that individual pretending to be from someone else in the bank, and basically stated that, hey, someone's coming by, make sure you get them in and out. 10, 15 minutes later, I showed up at the door in my disguise, my uniform with a fake company badge, and said I needed to get access to the network room. So while I was there, I demonstrated the ability to, place listening devices or other malicious devices in the area. The whole idea is that these social engineering attacks can happen not only remotely, but they can also happen face-to-face, and they can have just as high an impact because if someone gets a listening device or someone gets access to sensitive information in your physical facility, that can be just as damaging. Vishing is just the other, is basically doing it over the phone. And these are probably some of the things that you may have exercised or practiced against in the past. Call centers are common attacks targets, but it could be anyone within your organization, particularly people who have access to your sensitive systems, like your core financial processors, your core business applications, and they're basically going to try to either get you to do something. It could be in combination with sending you an email or a hyperlink, but they're going to try to give you some story to make them appear legitimate. I have an example on this particular slide. I'm not going to read it, but it's a fairly common one. If it was a call center for a business or a financial institution or even a health organization call center, they claim to be a relative of the individual they're calling about, and they're in an emergency and they need to get information on them. And they may be able to collect enough information online and from data gathering to give you some plausible information that they may be who they say they are. Ultimately, their success is going to boil down to your protocols and how your people have been trained. So we'll talk about defense. Those are some of the attacks. We talked about the weaknesses already. You know, how you defend against these things by building up three things. And this is just in Jerry Beasley's experience, but I think it'll be held out in most people's experience who have been in this business long enough. In order to be able to make people stronger as a human firewall, you need to change their attitude, their awareness, and their adherence to procedures. And we'll get into more detail on that. So first off, let's talk about the human weaknesses we need to address. Okay, so trust. In most cases, we're in some type of service organization, financial, medical, defense, power, whatever it might be, and we're usually in a position that we're there to help our constituents, whether they're credit union members or bank consumers or healthcare patients. We're there to help them, and we care about them, and that should never change. Another weakness is the curiosity. We're naturally curious about new things, and we'll get into some examples of that, but just to kind of keep you in context here, curiosity might be about some intriguing email with a greeting card or a love letter or something like that involved. Conditioning is what I mentioned earlier. To go into a little bit more detail, it's having some natural routine that you follow, providing access to people, giving information to people, and you become so accustomed to it that it's almost an automatic reflex. Unfortunately, that conditioning can instill complacency, so we want to make sure that we do some things to help remedy that. Lack of protocols is before. If you don't already have guidance of what to do in a particular situation, whether it be a phone call, an email, unusual email, or a face-to-face attempt at access, then it's less likely that people will follow the steps that they need to. If those protocols are in place and they're documented and they're practiced periodically, then the success of thwarting the attack will be much higher. All right, so let's talk about attitude. Yes, we're here to help our customers, but you actually have another responsibility, particularly when your customers are trusting their private and personal information to you. You're there to protect your customers or your members. I like to say, adopt the old proverb, trust but verify. Well, that's basically basically saying that you're still going to be just as helpful as you always were, but you're going to have a healthy skepticism about anything that's out of the norm or unusual. Ways to develop that attitude, and we'll talk about those soon, are allowing people to practice those circumstances so that they become more comfortable and more empowered to respond in the right manner. Awareness, of course, is just training, letting people know that, hey, there are cyber criminals out there, and we know and can recognize some of their techniques. Now, people may not feel comfortable with that at first, but if they're giving training and exercise opportunities, after a while, they'll know the patterns of activity that are happening around an attack, and they'll be more aware of it. And then finally, documenting your procedures, particularly for authorization, authentication, identification, and control. And we'll go into more details. The last thing is that people need to understand that when they have protocols, that there are no exceptions, and that they will never get in trouble or be sanctioned for following the procedures and doing the right thing. So, simple question: how do we instill that attitude, awareness, and protocols? And I think most of you probably know the answer by now. It's practice. And so we'll talk a little bit about ways that organizations can practice these things. And but I want to talk a little bit more detail about what makes that training successful. And again, this is just based on experience. This is based on performing hundreds of engagements over the years. But the organizations that do the best during social engineering exercise are the ones that do the exercises and training frequently. However, they do them at different times of the year. Well, you may wonder why. Well, if you're doing the same engagement every year on January 5th, and after a while people will recognize, oh, it's like, oh, this is social engineering week. It's like, you know, we know it's coming. What you need to do is do it at different times throughout the year so that they know that they need to expect it at any time. They should be a varying format, so they're not used to seeing, you know, that they're not accustomed to seeing the same old thing. They need to be aware of the patterns, not just the keywords or buzzwords. Once an exercise or training is completed, you need to talk to your folks and report to them what went wrong, what they did well, and what they could have done better to better protect the organization. Some of the organizations that I've worked with, they'll actually capture photographs. Some of them will use their surveillance video, but they'll basically put together training presentations to show someone either accessing their facility, or they'll show evidence that they gained access remotely through some type of email. Okay, so there's a number of different exercise types, and some of you may already be doing this today. One of the things you might do is sending simulated phishing emails out to your constituents, and doing it frequently. Some organizations do it as often as monthly, some of it quarterly, but the point is they send them out in varying formats over time, and after a while people get accustomed that when they open a message they don't recognize, they check it carefully. They're looking to make sure that it's from the right person, from the right domain, that it doesn't have any hidden attachments, and that the hyperlinks go where they say they are. Over time, you're going to collect data. As you see in the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, you'll be able to see behavior change over time the more exercise you do. And so we'll go into a little bit more detail on that. So talking about phishing campaigns, the first thing to remember about them is to try to make them realistic. In other words, if you send out simulated phishing emails, or if you work with a third party like Trace Security to send out emails, they need to be plausible. They need to be something that could be real, but they also need to have enough information in them that any reasonable person could detect that they are phony. The reason why we do that is because if the message is perfect in every way, then you really can't hold someone accountable if they open it thinking it's legitimate. You need to provide something like a discrepancy in the domain name, difference in the signature block, or the attachments and hyperlinks that they're not used to seeing. Phishing campaigns will use the tools and techniques of a real attack. What that means is that if you're doing simulated phishing and you have hyperlinks in the message, those hyperlinks would actually need to go somewhere. And in many cases, what an attacker will do is they'll have the hyperlink go to a temporary server, and then their temporary server will hook the user back to a legitimate server so that they don't know that they've ever had their information stolen. Phishing techniques do the same thing. They basically connect back to an intermediate server, and they keep track of what each of the users have done in terms of clicking on hyperlinks, opening messages, and so forth. And so that allows you to be able to report those specific actions. You can say at the end of an exercise, that X number of employees clicked on the messages, downloaded attachments, or followed links. We already talked about variety, but the simulated phishing emails could be anything from personal greetings to emergency account actions to what we call watering hole attacks. In other words, it's say, hey, be sure to go out and visit handbook.com or whatever, something that they're accustomed to visiting. And if the attacker has modified that site or spoofed that site, then it could be a malicious site. We do encourage organizations to do vishing campaigns or voice-based campaigns periodically as well. The reason being is because many of your organizations, and I don't know everyone on the line, but many organizations deal with their clients, their customers, their members via phone a significant portion of the time. And all an attacker needs, for example, if they wanted to carry out some type of money laundering operation and they need account information in order to be able to either access a current account or set up an illegitimate account, a lot of times they can get that information directly from the organization. They don't have to steal it. They don't have to, hack into the network. It's relatively low threat for them to make a phone call, particularly if they're spoofing their caller ID and you can't really tell where they're calling from. What we've seen in terms of success for these campaigns, though, is to keep a record, just as the slide indicates, of what was actually said during every call, who exactly was contacted, exactly what they did. And the reason being is that you want to be able to go back and show in detail to your people what was successful, what was not successful, what the right thing to do was, and whenever there was a compromise, why it happened. And by keeping good records, you're capable of doing that. Vishing campaigns should have the same characteristics as the other campaigns. They need to be plausible, they need to be realistic, and then you also need to report the specific actions. And obviously the format and type needs to change over time so that people aren't conditioned to be looking for a specific pretext on the attack. Now, there are all sorts of exercise types. We talked about some of them, like is illustrated here, the face-to-face, the physical breach where we actually just sneak into buildings. That's not so much social engineering in terms of manipulating people as it is social engineering to keep people from kicking you out whenever they discover you in the building. It's amazing if you walk through a facility, even if it's in a restricted area, and if you smile and greet people and say good morning and look them straight in the eye, they don't give it a second thought, and you can carry about and do your business. Sometimes face-to-face exercises are a little bit more elaborate. The bottom right corner there is one of our analysts that was actually dressed up in a hazard suit that was attempting to access an organization. So there are a number of different ways it can happen, remotely, on-site, or a combination of those. The in-person campaigns, same thing. They need to be plausible, they need to be realistic, and you're looking for a little bit different things, though. You're looking to measure whether people provided access, if they authorized visits properly, if they checked identification, if they logged them and recorded them in the manner that your policies state they should, and they're going to follow different formats. I've been an exterminator, an IT vendor, I've done insurance inspections, and the key to my success in those areas is that, and the attackers are going to do the same thing, is they're not going to walk in and not know what they're talking about. If I walk in as an insurance inspector, I'm going to know exactly what an insurance inspector looks for. So from a, if you try to detect me just from my behavior, you may not succeed. However, if you follow your protocols, like we talked about before, and check my ID, verify that the visit was authorized with whoever the purported coordination personnel was, then it's quite likely that you'll stop the attack. And then finally, there are red team exercises, and these are things that I've done as well, where we'll have an attack that is actually multidisciplined, and it's hitting your organization from all different areas. Social engineering is typically a big component of that, both for remote social engineering and on-site. And the whole idea is that if you're getting a multi-phase attack, if an attacker gets information from their external penetration test, or if they get information from a physical penetration test, they can then turn around and use that for additional social engineering or additional access to your systems. And there's the characteristics of a red team exercise. They're a little bit different in that they could include physical breaches as well as the technical and social engineering attacks, but it is a pretty good option for organizations, especially if you've been training for a long time and you want to up your game. So, talked a lot about training and exercise. Well, what happens? Well, I can tell you from my personal experience and talking to hundreds of clients who perform these exercises and attacks themselves in order to train their people, your team members, your employees, any other constituents that work in your organization, they will become more aware of potential attacks. They will become more skeptical, and that doesn't mean that they're going to be rude. It just means that they're going to know when something looks wrong and question it. The important part of that is they're going to feel empowered to deny information or access unless they followed the correct protocols, and they're going to become more comfortable with following those protocols as a result. These are just some examples of testing and exercise. All different ways. Credential harvesting can be done via phishing or websites, account information. Malware attacks by phishing, and phishing is basically either you have an attachment or a link, or you convince someone to follow a hyperlink over the phone. The whole idea is though that any of these could provide access to information. It could provide the introduction of malware, or it could provide direct access to information assets. All right, so I've said a lot, and hopefully I haven't talked your ear off, but really what it boils down to is this, that if you want to strengthen your human firewall, you need to remember these things. A significant proportion of cybercrime employs social engineering. Knowing that, and knowing that people are inherently vulnerable to social engineering techniques, we need to strengthen the human firewall. But we've discussed today is that you can do that, and you can do it very successfully, but through frequent training and exercise, particularly empowering people with and instilling in them an attitude of still caring about the business and their customers, but doing it with an attitude and awareness that they know that there are some bad things out there, and they're going to do the right things to protect your consumers and clients. We've discussed how testing and exercises can take many forms, and the variety and frequency of the training is just going to make it stick all the better. Your people will become much stronger as part of your human firewall. And so that's all I had, and I don't know if you plan on doing questions over the.
Yeah. So we can totally take some questions. If anybody has any, feel free to send them to us via chat or the Q&A option down there. We'll give it a couple minutes and let people type up some stuff. Obviously, if we don't get any questions, we will be posting this up, and we are available for questions after the fact for sure, if you do think of any.
Absolutely, and if you decide later that you have a question and you want to email us, that's perfectly fine too. I respond to client queries all the time, and I'm very happy to do that. It makes me happy to see organizations take their information security seriously and look for ways to strengthen it.
Jerry, do you have any advice? We have a question. Do you have any advice for a ransomware attack?
Well, yes, I do. But ransomware does not necessarily employ social engineering, although often it does, because we talked about the email payload delivery. The key thing about ransomware is preparation ahead of time. And by preparation, I mean by having offline backups of your data and being prepared to recover and resume operations with that protected data. That's really the number one key to being able to respond to a ransomware attack. But hopefully you want to be where you don't actually get to that point and you want to thwart the attack. Well, most likely, as we mentioned before, the ransomware attack they'll try to deliver it through an email hyperlink. In some rare cases, they may try to deliver it through an attachment to an email, but most email filters are pretty good about filtering attachments. So it's the hyperlink delivery is more likely. So basically, if you click on the link, it's going to take you to a website, and it may be totally transparent to you, but if your browser has enabled, for example, JavaScript to run, that website could be executing code in your browser and downloading malware to your system. So in terms of preventing ransomware, concentrating on the phishing aspect of social engineering is a good place to start. Now, that doesn't mean it couldn't be delivered in other fashions. For example, there have been cases where the malicious payloads have been delivered via USB devices and other types of media. But when you think about it, what's the cheapest thing for the attacker to do? An attacker can send out thousands and thousands of emails, and even if only 1% of 1% of the people actually click on it and download the malware, over time they're still going to have a large return because they're going to get that ransomware out to many, many people. And yeah, hopefully that answered the question, but if not, feel free to send a follow-up.
Yeah, for sure. I got a question. With ransomware, do you advise paying the ransom ever?
That's a decision that only the organization can make.
Right.
Obviously, from a industry perspective, if it's not something that is impacting human life, I would typically say not to. That you can typically recover the information in some form or fashion, because every time someone acquiesces to a ransomware attacker's demands, it makes the attack much more attractive to other people to try it. And so it's kind of like the thing, if you pay a ransom for a person, you're more likely to get kidnapped. The same thing is true of ransomware. So every organization has to decide that, because I know, for example, if there were a healthcare organization and they had a possibility of impacting patient care, they might make some other decision, but that's something that they have to decide.
Right. Cool. Well, don't see any more questions, so we'll go ahead and close it out. Jerry, thanks so much for joining us and
my pleasure.
Giving us some of your insights.